Okay. Our presenter tonight is Kenneth Klemmer. He hardly needs any introduction. Ken is a Michiganian, and from the time he was a young boy in Rochester, Michigan, he was fixing things and preserving things, and was curious about many, many things. And as a youth, he traveled and he visited historical sites, and this has been a passion all of his life. He later attended Lawrence Tech and Michigan State, where he focused on interior design, architecture, and historic preservation. Ken has been involved with preserving things from his youth. He started with model trains. He has since moved on to houses of distinguished architecture, such as Oakwood Cottage in Farmington, and also he has a passion for restoring British automobiles. Ken was our janitor in 2019, and his presentation tonight is entitled Fairlane Crossing. Okay.
Thank you. So the reason this whole talk came about, I belonged to a group, back when I was on Facebook, way back, I belonged to a group called Friends of Greenfield Village. And one of the people in the group had mentioned that he had some train-related things that he wanted to sell. One of them was this car that you see before you here, which is an O-gauge model of the Fairlane business car that Henry Ford owned. And this was built for the TCA convention in 2000. So I picked this up from him, and I didn't really know a whole lot about the history of the passenger car. And it inspired this talk. So that's and this is sort of an ADD talk, I've got to say, because everything I kept looking for in here, I kept going down all these other rabbit holes of interest, and I tried to coalesce it into a talk the best I could.
What was that initials? TC something?
TCA, which is the Train Collectors Association, and they had their convention here in 2000, and this was the convention car. Every year, the train nerds all get together, and they do a special car for each convention they go to. So this was the one for that year. You know what the three most exciting sounds in the world are? Well, some might say breakfast is served, lunch is served, dinner is served. George Bailey would utter the immortal words of Frank Capra, or maybe it was Philip Van Dorenstern: anchor chains, airplane motors, and train whistles. In the past 70 years, most people have never heard an anchor chain. Airplane motors have largely lost their allure, and train whistles have been replaced by hooting air horns. Is that a truck or a freight train? But once these sounds harken back to adventure and captured the imagination, this began to change shortly after the early years of the 20th century. Henry Ford, popularly known as one of the key developers of the automobile, was not an instant success. Indeed, many proponents of the horseless carriage came before him, and innovators, particularly in Europe, stretched the limits of imagination of the motor car during Ford's lifetime. Ford's own early efforts did not always result in the success he imagined, but his adaptation of mass production and innovative assembly methods for automobiles for everyone not only made him a popular hero of the working man, it made him extraordinarily famous and fabulously rich. Well, airplanes would indeed be in Ford's future. Practical travel considerations in the early 20th century were more limited. Ford's third incorporated attempt and real production of vehicles began in 1903, ironically just a few months prior to the Wilbur Wright flight of December 17 that year. Ford began with the Model A and progressed through most of the alphabet in a never-ending search for simplicity of engineering, efficiency of production, and economy of scale. And we'll conveniently ignore the unfortunately underappreciated Model K for the moment. This effort hit its stride in 1908 with the introduction of the Model T, and despite an almost continuous reduction in cost to build and subsequent reduction in sales price over its 19-year production, Ford Motor Company gained incredible market share so that despite building 2 enormous and fabulous assembly plants and countless component factories, by the teens, Henry would become the single most wealthy industrialist of the modern era. And you see an early car there. That's how you traveled out in the open. Closed cars were not popular in the early 20th century. And for a long time, they weren't popular because people were worried about accidents and the breakage of glass in them. So enclosed in a glass box was not where you necessarily wanted to be. The 1904 Model A you see here is owned by my friend Rick Linder. I think I've actually driven this car once.
Do you know anything about the car in the upper left there?
I don't recall where I found that photo. However, while America was rapidly mobilizing toward private transportation methods, climate, terrain, and roads were still largely abysmal once outside city limits during the Model T period. While the Model T was and still is an excellent all-terrain vehicle, the prospect of traveling many miles in one or some similar car was a grueling affair. And you know, they show this road here, and even in my own neighborhood, which has dirt roads in it, even in the 40s and 50s, people complained about how bad the roads were, and they had to park their cars on Orchard Lake Road and walk in during the muddy months of the early spring, because you couldn't even get through the neighborhood. You know, that was in a fairly incorporated place. Other vehicles at the time offered more speed or more comfort, but overland travel far from home was still an unappealing prospect when there was a much faster and more luxurious means of travel, the railroad, which was rising to its zenith at the same time. As Henry's empire grew rapidly, so did his need for travel. The construction of many supply facilities to feed the Ford behemoth in various parts of the country and world resulted in the need for Henry to visit and oversee various logistical issues firsthand. While some of these locations could be visited by automobile, much more were accessible by train. With Henry's growth of income also came his growth in popularity, and he increasingly was required to be shielded from his appreciative consumer base. This could partly be accomplished by chartering a private rail car, but even that method involves some exposure to the general public. This rise in popularity coincided with his first residence at 66 Edison Avenue. There's Jerry.
Jerry, wake up. It's 140. 140.
Well, it was 66.
Oh.
Yes. I was seeing if he would catch that. Thank you, Mark, for shedding light on that. His first residence at 66 Edison Avenue, no longer suitable for a man of his celebrity. By the time the famous $5 a day wage came in 1914, and so by 1916 he retreated to his new Fair Lane Dearborn estate. And this slide is, this is actually from 1915. This is just a few of the buildings that Ford had constructed around the country. Seattle, Denver, St. Louis, Philadelphia, every major city was pretty much represented here with assembly plants, dealer network. The vertical integration of Ford was staggering. As many of Ford's industrial sites were on or near water, one of his first means of private group travel was by his own yacht, Cialia, originally 170 feet with a 27-foot beam, clipper-bowed, and was commissioned in 1913 and purchased by Ford in 1917, only to be requisitioned by the U.S. Navy in the same year. She was returned to the Fords in 1920, at which time a refit was executed with interiors designed by Sidney Houghton, length increased, and a conversion to diesel engines. Cialia did not ultimately see much use with Ford and was sold in 1927. Incidentally, there is another Ford-owned Cialia, which initially caused me quite a bit of confusion, but it was the yacht of Edsel Ford, so there are two of them. Edsel Ford's yacht foundered in a storm, I think in 1929, and ended up getting, I think, scrapped at that point. In any case, in order to protect their privacy and make long-distance travel convenient, a plan was devised for Ford to obtain a private rail car. Private rail cars, also known as private varnish, or PV for short, were a relatively convenient and safer way for wealthy individuals to travel in the era before private aircraft became commonplace. Private rail cars still exist today. There are approximately 200 of them in use, some strictly for their owners and several in charter service. I think we should organize a Prismatic rail trip, and I've already found the company that can do it for us.
Great idea.
The organizational body of these cars is the AAPRCO, which is the American Association of Private Rail Car Owners. And they publish an excellent primer called, conveniently, So You Want to Own a Passenger Car. The basic gist of this book is how to make a small fortune with a passenger car by starting with a large fortune. Logistics are considerable, and most of these existed in Ford's time and still exist today. They make yacht ownership seem comparatively easy. A rail car needs to be stored in a suitable, secure siding location with power and compressed air available at all times. And this incurs some substantial fees, as you can imagine. It needs a trained maintenance staff authorized by the railroad to perform general housekeeping, stock the car, and today we have background checks. Security around rail yards is very tight. It's got to be really, really difficult today. Inspections of critical car components must be carried out by the railroad at their rates. You have water, waste, we'll talk more about that in a minute. Steam connections, heating or cooking fuel must be loaded and arranged by the railroad personnel. The railroad will also be responsible for obtaining washes and housekeeping services. The car needs to get inspected regularly for safety, proper coupler configuration, air brakes, physical clearance from obstructions, electrical and mechanical system compliance. It just goes on and on. Moving the car requires detailed instructions and cooperated from the railroad or railroads that it travels on, along with suitable motive power to accommodate it. Staff for the car must be provided by the owner, generally for the duration of each trip. Railroads generally require all passengers to be ticketed, regardless of whether they are in a private car or not. And if that isn't enough, most importantly, the place to travel has to be accessible by railroad, by trains running at normal scheduled times. Remember that today, Amtrak, which is really the only passenger service we have in the US, is federally funded and government operated. So it's got lots of layers of complexity that add to this. This also means that no connections or disconnections from the rest of the train. So these kinds of happenings can only occur at terminal points with longer stops and switching locomotive capability. So they've got a schedule to keep, even though they generally never do. Travel arrangements once arriving at a destination are also generally needed. Ford had it a little easier than most of them because he was traveling to places where he had staff. He had his own factories there. He was visiting dealers. He was visiting factories. He had his executives be able to drive him around. The impetus to purchase a private rail car also coincides with Henry's June 1920 purchase of the Detroit, Toledo, and Ironton Railroad in order to have control over freight operations near his primary manufacturing plants and en route to Ford Coal Holdings in southern Ohio. The story of DT&I is a whole talk in itself. Ford bought the entire line of 300 miles, which was humorously known then as the Darn Tired and Irksome, for $5 million, which included 80 locomotives, 2,800 freight cars, and a bunch of passenger cars. He spent $15 million in upgrades, making it the jewel of the rail lines. He wanted his engineering staff, his firemen and brakemen and engineers to wear all white to show how clean the trains were. He was just meticulous about making this a beautiful line. He spent about $15 million in upgrades, including ambitious plans for electrification. It was common for owners and division superintendents of railroads to utilize a private car as a sort of mobile office over the road. So perhaps this seemed like a logical choice for Ford to oversee operations. Recall that shortly before this 1920 spending spree, in 1919, Ford bought out all the other investors in Ford Motor Company, and he, Clara, and Edsel were the sole owners. And you'll see here a map of the DT&I running from Detroit down through Toledo and through central Ohio all the way to Ironton, and then another branch line off of that ran up to Tecumseh. And then the rail line itself, you can still see the catenary towers that ran along the rail line, which were to support the use of electric locomotives, which had an overhead collector shoe running on the overhead wire. Those towers are still there. There's about 7 or 8 tons of concrete in each one of them, and you'll see them along the main line if you go downriver at the if you head down Telegraph at, what is it, Pennsylvania or something, I think you can see the rail line there, and the towers are still there. Of course, there's no wire on them anymore. So Clara and Henry ordered their private railroad car from the Pullman Company on February 18th, 1920. So here's another diversion. A word or two about Pullman. Following the Civil War, the Pullman Palace Car Company earned a reputation for opulent passenger cars with comfortable sleeping accommodations. Company founder George Pullman, and what a great name. He was clearly destined for this. Designed for himself a private rail car to similar high standards. Pullman named the car PPC, his company's initials, and used it when traveling with his family. Pullman enjoyed lending the car to other dignitaries, by which he could simultaneously impress VIP passengers and advertise his company. Eventually, Pullman rented the car out to patrons who could afford the daily rate of $85. After George Pullman's death, General Counsel Robert Todd Lincoln, yes, that Lincoln, assumed the presidency of Pullman, and although he stepped down as president in 1911, he remained on the board of directors until 1922. Ironically, Ford purchases Lincoln Motor, named in honor of President Lincoln in 1922. Pullman was actually 2 companies by this time, a car constructor and a car operations group. Cars constructed by the company varied in configuration. They included coaches, sleepers, club cars, lounge cars, and dining cars. Some were owned and operated by the individual railroad and had the railroad's paint scheme and herald on the car. The operations side of the business leased cars painted dark green and lettered simply Pullman in gold to various railroads. And you saw a picture of that, back up 2 slides. That's one of the ones that it's just lettered Pullman. And those were just put in with trains with cars of their own road name. Included in the arrangement were the people to staff them, hence the famous Pullman porter and other service personnel. Pullman was at one time the largest employer of African Americans in the country. Of course, this convenient, all-encompassing approach eventually led to an antitrust suit brought by the federal government in 1904 and required further separation of services. Coupled with the downturn in railroad traffic following World War II, Pullman eventually ceased operations in the late 1960s. So anyway, back to Clara and Henry and their new car. They hoped to have it delivered by September of 1920 for a planned trip to inspect properties Henry had recently purchased in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. But delays pushed the car's actual delivery date back about 9 months. Some of those delays were due to the changes in the car interior. Clara oversaw the design of the interior spaces, working with Sidney Houghton of London, who I mentioned earlier, designed the interiors for Cialia. As is typical with Ford-owned properties, the appearance is one of restrained elegance and certainly not ostentatious. Ultimately, the finished car was delivered on June 23, 1921. The Fords named it Fair Lane after their estate in Dearborn. And Fair Lane was the area in County Cork, Ireland, where Ford's grandfather was born. The final bill for the rail car came to $159,000. That's about $2.3 million today. Higher than the original estimate provided by Pullman, which was $100,000. The Fords paid 25% of the cost upon placing the order, 25% draw during construction, and a final 50% on delivery. Surely it was worth the wait and expense. The car included accommodations for 6 passengers and sleeping quarters for 2 additional staff members. More could be squeezed in if necessary due to Pullman's iconic convertible berths. And when they traveled with this car, they generally traveled with a chef aboard and then just a general servant porter person. Service areas were at the front of the end of the car, with the galley located just in front of the dining room on the left side. Finished in stainless steel, the kitchen included an oven, stovetop, sink, and numerous cabinets. Food and supplies were loaded through the door at the car's front end so as not to disturb the passengers further back in the car. Staff quarters were located in the front of the car too. Compared to the other bedrooms, the staff room was sparse and utilitarian. The service corridor to the dining room ran aft along the right-hand side. So you see another view of the galley that's looking forward. The service corridor with the electrical panels heading back towards the dining room. And it's really hard to see what's going on in that last picture, but that's the crew quarters, which was basically just a couple of berths. The dining room featured an extension table that minimally seated 6. The chandelier, which hung directly above the table, was secured with guy wires that kept it from swaying as the car rolled. Built-in china cabinets housed the car's glassware and china. Clara Ford had Fair Lane stocked with 144 glasses, 169 pieces of silverware, and 230 china items. All of the items and cabinets were secured to prevent shifting and damage during travel. So you can see the differences in the period photo and the 1980s restoration. Some of the delicate plaster molding and the clear story is gone. The systems for passive ventilation, because the car eventually got air conditioning in the 1980 refit. And the light fixtures in the restoration aren't really right either. They're not nearly as elegant as the 1920s originals. The narrow corridor exits the dining room on the left side of the car, so we switch sides, and it goes all the way back to the lounge. 4 bedrooms were located along that corridor. The rooms were small but comfortable with a bed, and berths could be unfolded from above to provide an additional sleeping space if needed. Dressers and small desks rounded out the furnishings. Likewise, the bathrooms in Fair Lane were small but serviceable. Each one had hot and cold running water and a toilet. The master bath also included a shower. I mentioned earlier about waste retention, which is now done using holding tanks similar to a boat. However, typically during Ford's time, waste was simply flushed onto the roadbed. Indeed, toilets and trains often sported a placard above reading, "Passengers will please refrain from flushing toilets while the train is standing in or passing through a station." Apparently it was in vogue at the time to sing this along to Dvorak's humoresque number 7, which would go something like, "Passengers will please refrain from flushing toilets while the train is standing in or passing through a station." Pumping the waste tank is done by the railroad and is $150 each time nowadays. Another view of some of the bedrooms. Again, this is all the restored version of the car. At the rear of the car, a comfortable lounge functioned as a living room to read, relax, or simply watch the passing scenery. There are instruments on the bulkhead, both then and now, for speed, temperature, and time. Again, the 1980s renovation lacks some sophistication of the Houghton design. So this is how it looked in Henry's time, and it was just completed, and how it looks today. Again, I don't know who their lighting designer was, but they didn't do a very good job. Exiting the rear door of the lounge led one to the observation platform. Typically, Fair Lane was coupled to the end of a train, meaning that the view from the platform would not be obstructed. At speeds much above 40 or 50 miles an hour, though, the open observation platform was a windy, dusty, and especially in the steam locomotive era, a pretty dirty place to spend much time. It did make for great photo ops and was commonly seen in presidential election whistle stops for decades. So there's an image of some of the key components of the observation platform. And the photo on the right was a series of photos taken the day they sold the car. So that's it's actually sitting right outside the Henry Ford Museum in that photo. When Fairlane wasn't traveling out on a railroad, the car was stored in a shed built for it near Henry Ford's flour mill. Did you know he had a flour mill? It's another rabbit hole I went down for a little while, but I pulled out just in time. The flour mill was on Oakwood Boulevard in Dearborn. The shed was west of Dearborn's present and fairly new passenger station where Amtrak trains stop today. The shed was removed sometime after World War II, probably in 1957 when the mill was demolished for Ford engineering parking. So, you know, another example of Ford's vertical integration, he had need for bread to be made for his lunchrooms. So what does he do? He builds a flour mill, he mills his own flour, he sends it to his own bakery to bake his own bread, to serve on sandwiches in his facility, and he allows the employees to go to the mill and buy flour at a discount if they want to take it home. Just really incredible. So that the only example I found of this flour mill seems to be this bag of Ford flour, which shows a picture of the mill, and it shows that little shed off to the side, which would have been presumably for loading of flour onto boxcars, but I think the storage shed for Fairlane was something similar to that, from what I can see in the aerial photographs of the area. Most of the car's trips started and ended at Detroit's Michigan Central Station, about 8 miles east of the, depot, Ben. About 8 miles east of the car's storage location. The large station had facilities to clean and stock Fairlane, and crews to switch the car onto regular passenger trains. Michigan Central was a New York Central subsidiary, and New York Central trains provided direct service from Detroit to Chicago, New York, Boston, and all the other places in between. For longer trips, New York Central coordinated with additional rail lines to transfer Fairlane to other trains at connecting points, making the trip as seamless as possible for them. Usually, Fairlane was coupled to a regularly scheduled passenger train. The fee for pulling the private car was equivalent to 25 standard passenger tickets. One standard ticket on a train from Detroit to New York City in the early 20s cost about $30, meaning the Fairlane fee worked out to about $750 just to go to New York. So that's about $10,000 today. If Fairlane required special movement, if it was moved with a dedicated locomotive and not part of a regular train, then the fee jumped to the equivalent of 125 standard tickets. So then and now, it was really expensive to move this thing around. One of the key uses of the car was to take Clara Ford and her friends on extended shopping trips to New York City. In 1922, an overnight run from Detroit to New York City on the New York Central's Wolverine took about 16 hours, due to higher speeds and priority routing for passenger trains in those days. That same trip takes at least 24 hours today on Amtrak. Edsel and Eleanor also use the car occasionally to visit their vacation home in Seal Harbor, Maine. When the car was traveling on the DT&I, Ford had free passage for the car, but for non-DTI employees and guests, he reimbursed the railroad at standard passenger rates. So he paid himself back for everybody he took on board. The Fords made over 400 trips with Fairlane in the 2 decades they owned her. Annual excursions took Henry and Clara to their winter homes in Fort Myers, Florida, or Richmond Hill, Georgia. They hosted several special guests on the car. Presidents Warren Harding and Calvin Coolidge both spent time aboard, as did entertainer and humorist Will Rogers. Not surprisingly, Thomas and Mina Edison, Henry and Clara's closest friends, often traveled aboard Fairlane. By the early 1940s, Fairlane was aging and in need of either significant repairs or outright replacement. In the late 1930s, Edsel inquired about the cost of adding air conditioning to the car from the Pullman Company. They quoted $12,000 for the project, but curiously it was not done. Henry and Clara were aging too and weren't traveling quite as much as they had in earlier years. On top of this, the U.S. was joining World War II in December 1941, and wartime brought a lot of restrictions to materials, manufacturing, and travel, and all of those things kind of conspired to waylay further work on Fairlane. One trip the Fords made aboard Fairlane was to visit George Washington Carver at Tuskegee University, which at the time was called Tuskegee Normal and Industrial Institute. Their third and final visit to Tuskegee was in March of 1942. Fairlane switched off at Chehaw, Georgia, where a driver met the Fords and drove them to Tuskegee, which is about 130 miles away. Clara Ford toured the home economics building and the workrooms where the faculty taught women's industries, and she also rode in the elevator that Henry had funded and installed in Dorothy Hall in 1941 at a cost of $1,542.73 to ease Carver's climb up the stairs to his apartment. Somewhat reluctantly, Henry and Clara sold their private railroad car in November 1942. Photos were taken of the day it departed. The St. Louis Southwestern Railway purchased Fairlane from the Fords for $25,000. They modernized the car, most significantly the removal of the clear-story roof, and used it for railroad business, carrying executives on its lines concentrated in Arkansas and Texas. In 1972, the St. Louis Southwestern donated Fairlane to the Cherokee National Historical Society. The organization used the car as static office space for the Cherokee Nation in Tahlequah, Oklahoma. Richard and Linda Kuhn purchased Fairlane in 1982 from the Cherokee Nation in poor condition. The tracks that the car rode on to its final location had since been removed, so it needed to be lifted off its trucks and carried on a trailer. They took it to Tucson, Arizona, and began a 4-year project to restore the car to mostly its original Ford-era appearance. Unfortunately, they did not return the roof to its original configuration, although it's still visible from the interior. At the time, they updated Fairlane with modern mechanical, electrical, and climate control systems. The Kuhns only used Fairlane for a few short trips, Linda Kuhn only riding it once and swearing never again, before donating it to the Henry Ford in 1996, where it still resides. So my original thesis for all this was to draw parallels between private railcar ownership and today's equivalent, which is the ownership of a private business class aircraft, typically a jet. Of course, I got bogged down in the weeds, so the comparison's a little shaky. Today's railroad climate and single operator passenger train system means the logistics and destinations via railroad are quite limited. However, here are some key comparison and statistics for a private observation style car versus a similar capacity small jet And we're using a Cessna CJ2 for an example here. So on the left-hand side, you've got a heavyweight Pullman passenger car. It's about less than 200 in service today. 85 feet long. Interior cabin is about 5,000 cubic feet. It weighs about 100 tons, so it's about a ton a foot, plus a little. The floors in these cars were steel, and oftentimes they filled them with concrete to make the car heavier and ride better. Goes 70 miles an hour and carries 8 to 12 passengers. The Cessna CJ2 on the right, there are 13,700 small jet aircraft in use in the US today. 49-foot wingspan, cabin dimensions are really paltry. 300 cubic feet, 13'8" by 4'8" by 4'8". So it's 20 times smaller than Fairlane would have been. Weighs 7,900 pounds, goes 450 miles an hour, carries 5 to 7 passengers. So some pros and cons about each one of these. Pros on the observation car: great legroom and headroom, got a full kitchen, got fresh air, you can open windows, get your own bedroom, and now today it's really green. The railroad is the darling of the ecological movement. The cons: requires a locomotive, and you've only really got Amtrak for travel. You can move a private car by freight train, but you can't ride on it during freight operations, and the ride is really rough. It's slow. If the engine quits, you're taking Greyhound. If you own one of these, you might be labeled eccentric. And you have very limited access points and destinations. The jet, on the other hand, has a couple of pros. It's really fast. People will think you're a tycoon or a top-tier DJ. And you can pretty much take it anywhere as long as you got a 2,700-foot runway and a place to fuel it. Cons: you need a pilot. It's not green at all. It's really cramped. You got to wear seatbelts, and if the engine quits, you die. They don't glide very well. So, what's it cost to own one of these? In case you're thinking about it, to get a car, rail car today that's Amtrak approved is probably at least $300,000. Most of the decent ones are upwards of $1 million and up. Generally, they require some restoration and some work, and you can do it yourself and maybe save some money, but most of the time restoration costs are in the $500,000 to $1.5 million range. The fixed costs are relatively cheap. You're pretty much just paying to park it, and for that power and compressed air, so it might be 50 grand a year. Relocation fees, though, remember, you got to have a locomotive wherever you want to move it, even if you want to move it 20 feet. And that's about $1,000 minimum to get a locomotive to come out and shove a car around. So the operating cost per hour is anywhere from $300 to $1,000 an hour. So I calculated the raw cost to go from Detroit to New York City. So that's the trip that Clara would have made. It's about $6,500 today. Takes 24 hours of time. And it's actually lower than the comparative cost in 1920, because it was $750 back then, which equates to about $10,000 today. So the price to do that has actually gone down. Just for reference, Fairlane, we mentioned earlier, was $2.2, $2.3 million in today's money to build. Our Cessna here, acquisition costs, this is for a used one, by the way, it's not for a brand new one out of the factory, about $2.5 million. The annual fixed cost, and I find this hard to believe, but maybe the pilots in here can verify this. Cessna says it's $450,000 per year in fixed costs to store, maintain, and deal with the aircraft. That translates to $50 an hour, 24/7, 365. So the only way you could really have something like this is to charter it and put it in use and fly it as much as possible. Operating cost per hour per Cessna is $1,500. So the raw cost to take a jet like this from Detroit to New York City ends up being about $4,500 by the time you pay landing fees and fuel and operating costs and a pilot. But you can do it in under 2 hours. Does that kind of jive, Rod? You're a pilot?
That actually might be a little low.
It might be low.
Yeah.
So the charter cost, if you charter a jet like that, is about $9,000. And it's the same whether you got one person on it or six. You're still paying all that up front. So, based on my original question, was the private rail car the private jet of its day? I think the answer is a hesitant yes. Estimates of the number of private rail cars in 1920 are somewhere below 2,000. But so many of those were for railroad executives, and they were integral to railroad operations. All those railroads that were around at the time, and there was about 1,000 of them in 1920. They had 250,000 miles of track in the U.S. Each one of those railroads was thousands of miles. The industry employed about 1.5 million people. I think that's probably a little low. I think it's probably closer to 2 out of a total population of 106 million in the country at the time. A great percentage of wealth was held privately as opposed to corporations. There is no estimate of truly private car ownership in 1920, but I think it probably could have been somewhere around 10% of that fleet. So maybe 200 cars were truly private just for the use of their owners. Today our population is near 330 million, 3 times that of 1920. The rail industry is still large, employs about 1.1 million people. There are still over 600 railroads in the country, which is hard to believe. Only 7 of them are Class 1, and there's Class 1, 2, and 3 railroads, and the breakpoints between those divisions changed over time. But right now, I think $500 million in revenue yearly is a Class 1 railroad. Class 2 is below that, then you have Class 3, which are the short lines. Total track in the U.S. is down to about half of what it was in the 1920s. A handful of these railroads still own and use private cars for charter, but most of the remaining 200 that exist today are privately owned. So there's about 89,000 people in the U.S. with net assets of at least $50 million. And that's the zone in which private jet ownership is prevalent. There's a business aviation fleet of nearly 14,000 aircraft in the U.S., and approximately 9,000 of those are jets of varying size. Most are owned by corporate entities. Maybe 10% are privately owned. It might not even be that high. So at best you have 900 jets that are truly private. So even though there are much more private jets than rail cars, even when adjusted for population, the population increase since 1920, not much could be more exclusive 100 years ago. So the private car was truly the jet of its day. Thank you.
I have not seen it. Where is that located near the Henry Ford?
So they had it outside for a short time when they were doing some construction in the museum over the last, I think this was taken about 2 years ago. So they had it sitting outside for a little while. Normally it sits inside the museum with all the other locomotives and trains. It's kind of in the back corner of the museum. But typically you cannot get on it. It's not open to the public.
Who took the pictures of the interior?
So those were taken by the Henry Ford. They did a whole, COVID has made kind of a mess of this talk because my plan was to go to the Benson Ford Library, which has all the archives on this car from the day it was built, Ford's ownership, Kuhn's restoration, everything, but you can't get in the Benson Ford right now. So I was kind of stuck working with their online archives and somewhat limited pictures, but they did do a really nice series of 360 views of the interior of the car just in the last couple of months, so it was kind of lucky we had those. That's right.
You bring to mind an experience in the 1970s in life. I was selling industrial automation and for Honeywell at that time, and they did in fact have a fleet of Gulfstream II aircraft, which were available to me as a salesman if I cared to bet my career on spending 5,000 rocks an hour to take some clients on that thing, but I better damn well get the sale. Well, I had a $30 million sale coming out of a place called Surface Combustion in Toledo. So I took them down to the plant where their equipment was to be made in Phoenix by way of that Gulfstream 2. So down we went and we came back to Toledo, whereupon we got them off, and the pilot turned to me and said, well, where do you need to go now? I said, well, I can't afford you guys anymore, go home. He said, oh, whatever. And I said, well, I live up near Detroit. I said, okay, we'll drop you at Detroit Metro. So up we came from Toledo to Detroit, which I noted he was working approach in the tower in Detroit before we took off at Toledo. So it was a short plane. But when we got to Detroit, out of that airplane I got by myself. Of course, I didn't explain to anybody that I was just a salesman. Everybody no doubt thought I was really somebody. But that was rather a highlight. That was about 1976 or so. But at that time, it was 5,000 rocks an hour off which was like my annual budget for sales expense. Yeah. Just right on that damn thing.
Well, remember, it's burning $50 an hour just sitting on the tarmac somewhere too, so you might as well fly up.
Yeah, tell the brass and Honeywell that.
Good to see you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah. I continued to work for them for several more years as a result.
Did you say there are 600 railroads in America today?
There are.
Yeah. Wow.
There's 29 or 30 just in Michigan that you've never heard of. They're short lines. Some of them are only like 25 miles. But yeah, there's a surprising amount. I had no idea until I started researching this talk. There were that many.
Wow.
There's a small rail line that runs from the main north-south on the eastern quarter into Princeton University. It runs about a few miles. It's called the PJ&B, Princeton Junction and back.
Yeah.
As you take the train from Baltimore to Princeton, you get off at the junction in somewhere in New Jersey, the Princeton Junction, and you catch the little train for 5 minutes into Princeton.
Yeah, that's one of those 600.
And that still exists. I assume it does. Why not?
Yes, Bill.
Ken, are some of those 600 owned by other railways?
Yeah, there's some conglomerates that own a number of the short lines.
The reason I ask is
Watco is one
many
of
years
them.
ago when I was in college, I had a temporary job with the C&O in Cleveland. And a friend of mine who got me the job was working in the secretary's office. And this was in the terminal tower in Cleveland. And he took me up and took me in the vault and showed me all of the official stamps of all of the small railroads that the C&O owned.
Mm-hmm.
You would never know at that railroad that it was the Blankenship and Natchez Railroad. It was all C&O branded.
Sure.
But it was still a separate company.
Mm.
And there were several of them.
Yeah, oh yeah, yeah.
Ken, were all the private cars full size? Did anyone say, I like a private car, but can you make it a little bit smaller?
You know, I don't know. I don't really know the answer to that. There's some small cars that are a little smaller. I mean, some of the private cars that people own today are baggage cars. So they might be a 65-foot car, or a combine car, which has some seating and baggage, and maybe they make some money.
They would pick those up cheap.
They would probably pick those up cheap, but
They're
the
just
real,
sightings all
the
over
really
place.
jewel ones are these observation cars. That's what everybody wants.
Well, there's also the heavyweights are the ones everybody wants. There are some lightweights out there
Yeah.
that the guys use, but they're not quite as opulent as the heavyweights.
Yeah, the era of the heavyweight was definitely before World War II. When they went to much larger cars.
Early in your talk, you talked, I think, about the sleeping car, the restaurant car. I assume it was just an oversight on your part about the cocktail car?
Well, that's the club car,
Oh, okay.
the bar car.
I missed that.
Ken, I was gonna mention, I grew up in the area around Oakwood, right where Dearborn, Allen Park, Melvindale come together. And I remember as a kid walking the rail lines and seeing those columns, and it was amazing to see them, and they were, you know, scattered in such a way that you looked at them from a standpoint, you looked at them as Roman ruins, you know, and it was amazing that you had mentioned, because I recall those as a kid, and looking at that, and you could actually see the points where they were looking at electrification, as you indicated.
Mm-hmm.
And it was amazing to think that we were so far ahead, and yet we never took advantage of it.
Well, they ended up electrifying most of that line. And
But it's not today.
But not today, yeah. When they sold, when Ford got out of the railroad business, he didn't stay in it long. He didn't like the regulation. I think he published some rant about it, you know, about how government was choking the railroad industry as he was wont to do, and I think he sold DT&I by 1929. So that was kind of the end of it. Most of the locomotives that he had all refit, they scrapped them all. But he made a pretty penny on it, though. I think he sold it for, he bought it for $5, he spent $15. I want to say he sold it for like $60 million.
Wow.
So he did okay in his 9-year investment. So, thank you. So tonight's dinner is all my favorite things. We already had the appetizer side of it. For dinner we have garden salad, caprese salad, rolls, rainbow carrots, Brussels sprouts with balsamic glaze, and beef stroganoff and vegetarian stroganoff. And for dessert we have bumpy cake and almond joy cookies. Bon appetit.
Wow.